All right, so before we look at how Descartes discovered God, his God, right? The all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God, that he needs to have 100% confidence exists in order to know that he couldn't be hopelessly possessed by an evil demon, because such a God wouldn't allow that to happen. And if he's not possessed by an evil demon, then he can go on his merry way and start making claims about reality again and trusting his thoughts and trusting his conclusions. Now, before we look at this, I should have put this out way earlier. When we look at Plato, when we look at Aristotle, or we look at Aquinas, or any of these ancient thinkers, or we look at Descartes or Leibniz, who we're going to look at, the question for us isn't so much, do I agree with the claims that they make or the conclusions that they've come to? So when you read about Plato, do you think like, should I accept his vision, the structure of reality in its perfect forms? It's like that. It's fine. You can ask yourself that question. But that's less important than understanding how the thinking that these folks engaged in has created a narrative, a story of Western civilization that continues to this present moment, right? That cliche about standing on the shoulders of giants, that's what we're doing right now in this class. We're looking back at people, imperfect people, who existed long before us in very different circumstances, who nonetheless engaged in particular kinds of thinking that had an impact on others. It either put an idea in somebody else's mind about how they too could apply that method of thinking to something, or they too could take a conclusion that somebody came to and extend it further and see where it took them, or take a conclusion that somebody came to and said, I don't think that's right and here's why. And this story continues on to today and where we are today. So we can look back at Descartes and say, Cartesian dualism, this idea that there's a mind, a non-material mind, and a body that somehow interact causally with one another. I don't know anybody who takes that very seriously today. But Descartes remains one of the most influential thinkers in modern philosophy, in Western civilization. And it's not because of what he said, it's because of what he demonstrated as a way of engaging with our lives and our realities and nature. And so when we look at Descartes, we probably think less about whether or not we agree with him and more about like, wow, in that circumstance, knowing what people knew and what people assumed to be true, I can see how this would have been a very revolutionary thought that was come up here. This was very unique kind of thinking, and that's why we're reading about it 500 years later, 600 years later. All right, so Descartes, he believes ideas can come to me in one of two ways, he says. Either I get an idea from an experience I've had, or I was born with an idea. Okay, those are the only two ways Descartes thinks we can get ideas in our minds, concepts in our minds. So clearly I can go around and I can learn what a pizza is by looking at and tasting a pizza. In other words, the experience of pizza gives me the concept of pizza. I can't just think my way to pizza. But Descartes says, I think I figured out that there are ideas I was actually born with. There are ideas I didn't get from experiences, right? I never experienced identicalness or sameness, but I have this concept of sameness. I must have this concept because I was born with it. And so now Descartes says, can I think of an idea that I was born with that would allow me to draw the conclusion that this God that I really hope exists has to actually exist? Here's what Descartes said. He has the argument from perfection. And before we rock and roll into this, let's get one thing clear. Perfection is not subjective. What you think perfection is not the same. Not different than what I think perfection is. We agree on what perfection is. Are you yelling at your computer yet? Like, what is this dude saying? Perfection is simply that which is without flaw. Okay, that's what perfection is. Now, you and I might disagree about what deserves the label perfection. What kinds of things are perfect. We can certainly disagree about that. But we're talking about the same thing, right? If we disagree about whether or not something's perfect, it means that one of us thinks it has no flaws and the other one thinks it has some flaw. Okay? So this is really important for Descartes' argument here. Perfection is that which is without flaw, not what we describe things as. His first premise is this: a being that doubts is an imperfect being. Okay? And Descartes' reasoning would be this. If you have doubts about something, that means that you don't have complete knowledge. It means that there's something that's unknown, or something that you're unsure of about some topic or some event. And this is a gap in your knowledge. In other words, you don't have perfect knowledge. If you did have perfect knowledge, you wouldn't doubt, right? So Descartes says, a being that doubts is an imperfect being because it has gaps in its knowledge. And then Descartes says, well, as I've been showing you, I doubt. I can doubt my own body. I can doubt the reliability of my sense experiences. So because I'm a being that experiences doubt, I'm obviously an imperfect being. If I were perfect, I wouldn't experience any doubt, but I do. So I've got to be an imperfect being. And then here's a sort of tricky premise we'll revisit here later. He says, yet I could know that I am an imperfect only by having the concept of perfection. Okay, so Descartes' reasoning is this: is like I have these concepts. Like there's this task that's impossible. Well, the concept of impossible really derives from the concept of possible. If I didn't have a concept of possibility first, I couldn't have a concept of not possible, right? So impossible, not possible, has to come after my concept of possible. And Descartes is saying the same thing about perfection. That which is imperfect is not perfect. So I have this knowledge that I'm an imperfect being, but I could only have that knowledge if I first had the idea of perfect. And I do therefore have the concept of perfect because I have the concept of imperfect. Me having the concept of imperfect necessarily requires that I had first had the concept of perfection. That's the only way I can know what's not perfect, is by understanding first what perfection is. Then Descartes reasons, I could not have received the concept of perfection from something imperfect. Therefore, my concept was not derived from myself. Okay? So Descartes saying, if I have this concept of perfection, there's two ways I could get it. One way is by experience. So if I have this concept of perfection that I've gained from experience, then that would mean that I've experienced something that is perfect. But, of course, Descartes would say nothing is perfect. At a minimum, everything dies. Everything changes. Everything ceases to be. Nothing has been timeless, right? There are all of these, I'm calling them flaws, but there are all of these features of everything that has ever existed and will ever exist. There are these features of them that are limited, okay? And if they're limited, it means they're not complete. And so Descartes saying, therefore, I've never experienced anything in reality that's perfect. And I'm not perfect. So I couldn't have gotten this concept for myself. It must have been a concept that came to me from something that was perfect, that I didn't experience. Because I haven't experienced anything perfect. I have this concept. Therefore, the concept must have come from something perfect. What's that, I wonder? God. God is perfection, according to Descartes, right? So God is perfect, and God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. And what Descartes would mean by that is God can do anything that can be done, right? He can't do things that are logically contradictory. He can't know things that are unknowable, but he is all-knowing. He can know all the things that are knowable. He can do all the things that are doable. And so Descartes is saying, this is by definition the definition. This is by definition the definition. This is the definition of God. God is flawless. That must be where I got this concept of perfection from. So God has to exist. God has to exist because I have the concept of perfection, and I could only have gotten the concept of perfection from something that is perfect. There is nothing in my experiences that are perfect. I'm not perfect. Therefore, God, as the perfect being, was where I got this concept of perfection from, and I could have only gotten that concept of perfection from God if God actually exists. Because if God didn't exist, God wouldn't be perfect. So, I'm not possessed by an evil demon. Yay! Okay, now think about what this does for Descartes, right? Because he starts off by saying, you know what, I can't trust the world of my senses, that illusion stuff, the dream stuff. I had that possibility of the evil genius kind of corrupting my own thinking. I was able to get down to this bedrock of this certainty that I exist as a thinking thing, as a non-material thinking thing that may not even have a body. I can't be certain I have a body, but I'm certain I exist as a thinking thing. And so the essence of who I am is a thinking, wondering, doubting, questioning, non-material thing. And because I've proven that God exists by the fact that I have some innate ideas, Descartes says, I'm certain I have some innate ideas, and I can use those innate ideas to prove that God exists, I can trust my thinking again. And so I get to go have fun doing the things that I really like to do, like math and physics, okay? And I've done this in a way, Descartes says, where the church isn't going to be angry at me. Because what I've done is I've said, look, all the science that we're doing, it rests very much on a godly foundation. And that godly foundation is the soul. So it rests, this scientific activity, it rests on the foundation of the soul, but the soul is impervious to any probings of science, any findings of science, because science can only deal with what's observable and measurable. And Descartes said, hey, the only thing I'm certain of is I exist as a non-material thing. Maybe I'm embodied, but not necessarily. The real essence of who I am is non-material, and therefore it's off limits to science. Now, this creates some problems, of course, right? So you and I have this, what we would call a common sense experience of reality, what some people call like naive realism. In other words, it's sort of that, what you see is what you get. Oh yeah, right there on the screen, sorry. What you see is what you get. You know, I look at the computer, it looks a particular way to me, that's the way I assume it is in reality. But if we accept Descartes' version of reality, it gets kind of weird. Because Descartes is saying, I can't necessarily draw any conclusions about reality based on my sense experiences, but I can trust my thinking. And so math and physics, like Balmer, that's how I'm going to understand and describe what reality is. But that's super counterintuitive, right? It's sort of like looking at Einstein's equation laid out, the E equals mc squared, and you look at that and, you know, somebody's looking at you and saying like, there you go, that's how space-time functions. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense to me. That's not how I experience space-time. And Descartes kind of got himself, he doesn't care because he gets to do what he wants to do. But he has, for all the rest of us flunkies that can't understand his complicated math and physics, we're sort of out of the picture in terms of discussing with him what reality is actually like. All right, so there's our hero, Descartes.